Okay, so tell me why coffee and tea. We have
coffee and tea.
Because I agree with you, and yet people are doing it wrong.
Okay, so here's the thing about coffee and tea. There's a lot of studies out there showing how people fare based on, we look at their diet and their lifestyle and what they eat and drink over decades. And then we look at how long they live and what diseases they do and don't get. These are called epidemiological studies. And they have their downsides because correlation isn't causation. But over time, we learn to filter out how many of them were smoking, and smoking accounts for this much worse life expectancy and this much higher risk of disease. So we adjust the data based on that. So if people who are, say, drinking more coffee are also more active, are also exercising more, are also smoking less, we try to adjust for that and then say, okay, what does that leave us with, right?
Right.
So after adjusting for that, and I'm not just talking about 1 or 2 studies, I'm talking about dozens of them involving literally hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people over decades, you get some interesting data, right? And the data is overwhelming. People who consume coffee have higher life expectancy, have lower risk of Alzheimer's, lower risk of cardiovascular disease, and lower risk of type 2 diabetes, more balanced blood sugar, lower rates of obesity, and are more economically productive for what that's worth. Crazy. So you put all that together, okay, obviously it's a drug that's making people's brains more active. Maybe they're doing more stuff. Well, maybe decaf seems to have a lot of the same benefits, so not quite all of them, but that may be because we lose some nutrients in the decaffeination process.
Yeah.
Coffee is by far the highest source of antioxidants in the American diet. By far. Now, partly that's because we're getting way too few antioxidants.
I was just gonna say.
So we don't know for sure. If somebody was eating a super healthy diet already, and then they did or didn't drink coffee, how would that affect things? Hard to know for sure. But based on what Americans are eating and drinking, coffee is radically accelerating their life expectancy and health. And part of it is that it's making the blood flow. It actually dilates blood vessels, right? Yeah. Which is part of its cardiovascular benefit, but that brings down inflammation. It brings down blood pressure, but also increases blood flow, which makes for more energy, which is why sometimes runners will use coffee before a big race. But it also gets our brains thinking. Now, is there a benefit to having our brain think? Yes, obviously there is, and we're more active and engaged. All that said, some people don't do well with the caffeine. I mean, truly, some people are jittery. They're wired. They can't have coffee after 10 in the morning because then they're up at night and they can't.
Yes, I'm actually that person.
Yeah, absolutely. So not everybody is the same. And it's one of those compounds, caffeine, that affects people very differently. And there's what's called the half-life. How long is it in your system? For some people, the half-life is half an hour. For some people, it's all day.
Oh, it's so how you metabolize
exactly.
Coffee.
So if you're a slow metabolizer, you're actually going to do less well with it, most likely, and have more of the negative effects, the jitters and the distress. So coffee's not for everybody, even though studies show that it's good for most people. Green tea also has some caffeine, but it also has L-theanine and some other compounds in it that help mitigate, that are actually calming agents. So it doesn't create that buzz in the same way. And green tea is even more loaded with antioxidants and a whole host of phytochemicals. Matcha is even at the top level there. So out of all black tea and oolong and green, they're all coming from the same tea plant.
Right.
And they're just processed in different ways. Green is the least processed, and then matcha is actually the whole leaf ground up after it's been fermented.
Oh, I never knew.
And so you get loads of antioxidants and health benefits from that. And if you don't do well with any of those things, hibiscus is even more loaded with antioxidants.
I love hibiscus.
So hibiscus tea is number one above all else. Any drink we know of that humans consume for antioxidants. So hibiscus is fabulous if you don't want to do the caffeinated beverages at all. If there was sort of a pecking order, I'd probably say from an antioxidant perspective, hibiscus tea, green tea, then you've got oolong, then you've got black, and then you've got coffee.
So it's coffee, even though all the wonderful things
exactly.
you said,
well, at least
it's low on...
In terms of some of the critical antioxidants and phytochemicals. And then in terms of caffeine, coffee is the highest of those things that I just named.
Right.
But interestingly, yerba mate seems to also have incredible health benefits. There is some concern that it may be linked to higher risk of cancer. We're still not sure about that, so I'm a little cautious on yerba mate, but I personally love how it makes me feel, and it doesn't create the jitters that coffee does. So everything, you've got to listen to your own body. Just because studies show that something's good for most people most of the time doesn't mean it's good for everybody all the time, or it's good for you right right now. So I'm a big fan of like, be your own N of one, experiment, pay attention. I think that actually attention is one of the most powerful forces in the universe. So when you bring love and care and attention to your body, you're already sending signals of, I care, you matter, and I'm curious about you. And so that's a powerful force. And then, so you got to do that, especially with the caffeinated beverages, because we really are different. But in general, for most people, coffee can be super healthy. Now, let me also add that a lot of people are adding a bunch of cream and sugar.
I was going to say, I feel like we need to say the type of coffee, because people will listen to this and they'll go rush off to some of the franchises that your grandfather started.
I mean, there are Starbucks drinks that have more sugar in them than Coca-Cola. And then they've got a bunch of factory farm dairy in there, which, by the way, Starbucks spends more on dairy than it does on coffee, I believe. And you wind up with a product that's a lot of other stuff that probably isn't doing your body any favors. And the studies show that when you add milk to coffee, you reduce the efficacy of the antioxidants in there quite significantly. Now, it's interesting because you would think that some of the fat would help slow absorption of the caffeine and so forth. But personally, I add unsweetened plant milks to my coffee when I do cold brew, by the way, because coffee can be acid forming.
I love the cold brews.
Yeah.
I almost too much. They're so smooth that I could drink too much and then I'm up at like 2 a.m.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And they actually can be more highly caffeinated.
Yeah.
Too. But when you mix that, I make a homemade latte. So I mix like half of it is unsweetened soy milk, and then half of it is the cold brew coffee. Yeah. And I enjoy that very much. Yeah. But I make sure I'm done by 1 p.m.
Right. But what we're not saying is, if I look at this through my toxic lens, there's not only are we looking at some of the cancer-causing chemicals that are in some of these coffees, but like tea, for example, I've recently heard that there is plastics in almost every, major tea brand out there that people are drinking. Is there a good litmus test that we can say, hey, this is how you know you're getting clean coffee and tea?
It's a little bit hard to know for sure, because you got to do you trust the manufacturer?
Yeah.
You can contact them and ask if they have a policy. Do they test for plastics? Where are their sources?
I do that a lot, actually.
And it's interesting because when you do that, eventually they'll put a thing on their website and you can just Google it. And, at least they know people care and are paying attention, because they have no incentive economically to do the more expensive thing that creates a better product if nobody knows about it. Right. So when people care and ask, then they know, oh, there's an interest in this. Fair trade is a good example of that. A lot of folks realized a while back, wow, a lot of our coffee and chocolate is coming from slave labor, from farmers that are in destitute conditions. Well, guess what? When farmers are in destitute conditions and they've got a toxic pesticide that's going to increase their yield and let them feed their kids next year or go to school, have their kids go to school, they're probably going to use it, even if it's regulated and not legal in the United States. So there's a lot of incentives to cut costs or to use plastic in the processing of the tea, for example, right? So you want to invest in, I think, fair trade as much as you can afford to.
Okay, so
because that's a way
labeled.
There's a lot of different certifying agencies. They're not all perfect, but they're all big steps in the right direction.
Okay.
So fair trade, especially with coffee and chocolate, is important. Chocolate, most of our chocolate in the world comes from the Ivory Coast in Ghana and West Africa, where child slavery is a big deal. There's a lot of kids that are not going to school. They're working in the fields 12 hours a day under terrible conditions. Some of them are literally separated from their families and sold off into slavery by the hundreds of thousands. And most of that is in the chocolate industry. And I don't want any part in that. So I choose to go with fair trade or organic. And here's the thing about organic. There's no organic chocolate being grown in West Africa right now. So it's coming from Central America for the most part when it's organic, which means at least you're avoiding the most extreme forms of enslavement. So
it's chocolate or coffee?
I'm talking about chocolate right now, but coffee has some of the similar dynamics.
Problems.
Where I want the people who grow my food to be paid enough to feed their own families.
Yeah.
And so fair trade is a way to help to ensure that. And in the process, you tend to get a cleaner product.
Yeah.
Now, organic certified is also great because, again, folks who are certifying organic tend to be doing other things right. And obviously, there's less pesticides involved in organic agriculture, which is better for the environment and farmers and farm workers and for our health.